Hi, everybody. Today is Thursday, March 20th, 2025, and our friends Michael Hudson and Richard Wolff are back with us. Welcome back. Let's get started with what has happened in the United States. Richard, if you remember when the Trump administration, when Donald Trump decided to be the next president, decided to be part of the presidential election, he was talking about the US economy. We are going down, we are getting destroyed by right and left and by China and all of that. And he's now in office in Washington. And the decision he's making in terms of the foreign policy of the United States, he got back just 2 days ago to the Middle East fighting Yemenis. He's it seems that he's not that much successful with the way that he told us he's going to deal with Russia and Ukraine. How do you see the way that he's running the foreign policy of the United States?
Well, as usual, the foreign policy of the United States, like that of many countries, is a pale second to their domestic policies, often shaped by, responding to, and ultimately determined by their domestic situation. And I think you're going to see that as well. Let me do it by an example actually drawn from Europe. Europe is behaving in a very bizarre way. It's behaving, for example, by saying something that is silly, that they are going to fight Russia without the United States. And as I would be interested in pursuing, my guess is that the strikes by Ukraine into Russia over the last 2 or 3 weeks are an activity undertaken by Britain and France and Germany, not by Ukraine. This is a way for them to do three things: demonstrate that they can do military action as well or better than they did with the United States. That's not true, but it is a public display that allows them to behave as if they had that capability, number one. Number two, it is necessary to justify hostility with Russia, is necessary to justify the building up of their own defense forces, which they are all about to do, or at least the Germans have already done it in the votes they took earlier this week, to do two things that Germany had vowed not to do. And in particular, that Christian Merz, the new leader of Germany, had campaigned he would not do. He campaigned he would not increase the national debt of Germany. He just led the way to increase the national debt of Germany in order to rearm Germany at a pretty hefty pace. It's not a hefty pace in terms of the military of the United States, Russia, and China, which it will take Germany a long time to equal, let alone threaten. So this is a theater more than it is a reality at this point. But it is a necessary game to play, to be active in Ukraine, to justify helping Ukraine, to justify military buildup, and to keep going the one political idea of the governments of Europe since the Second World War. The single most important idea is that they are a bulwark against the Soviet Union. That's why NATO was created. That's why the rearmament. That's why the Marshall Plan, all of it. And the European politicians, and I want to remind people that the political leaders of Europe, from the Scandinavians in the north to the Italians and Greeks in the south, were systematically trained, funded, and chosen by the United States' State Department, CIA, and all of that. Periodically, it was exposed, but it was always going on. You wanted the United States wanted Western Europe to do for the West and America what the Russians, the Soviets, wanted Eastern Europe to do, from Poland in the north to Bulgaria in the south. And that's how the World War II ended. And that's how it was divided up. So you have to remember that everything about Europe since the Second World War has been within the context of its strategic location in the American mentality, because the United States was such a dominant player. And that's exactly what is now disappearing. That's why our times now are so tumultuous and why we're having trouble understanding them, because a constant story, 1945 to 2020, is falling apart. It is no longer there. Let's go back. So, what did the Europeans do? They cut a deal with the United States. And this will shed light on the American foreign policy and its relationship to our economic situation. It was a deal. The United States and Europe were afraid of the same two things. They were afraid of the Soviet Union because of what it had achieved in World War II, as crucial to the defeat of Nazis as anybody else, if not more so. And they were also afraid of the extraordinary rise in the power of left wing socialist, communist, Keynesian forces in their own country. That had never been seen before. At the end of World War II, the communist parties of Western Europe and the United States, the socialist parties of Europe and the United States, were stronger than they had ever been before. In the United States, they were stronger because they were the militants who worked with the CIO to get you the New Deal. And they had all the prestige. Roosevelt was their choice. And Roosevelt was reelected president 3 times. I mean, no one had ever achieved that political power that concentrated for that long. You have to remember that that was number one. Number two, there was a terrible anxiety that the war, when it was over, would mean the demobilization of the military and the closing of the factories making guns and planes and missiles, because you didn't need them anymore. And if that happened, wouldn't you risk being plunged back into the Great Depression, which is where the war broke in the first place? So it was logical. That's why they passed the housing bill, the GI Bill, to take all those returning soldiers and stick them in a university rather than have them be part of the army of the unemployed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was great fear of the Depression, of the already strengthened socialist and communist parties. In Europe was the same. They were afraid of the return of the Depression, but they had an extra problem. In their countries, they had been occupied by the Nazis, and they had developed very powerful resistance organizations in Norway, in Italy, and everywhere between. And the leaders of that resistance, communists and socialists, making those parties and their leaders very popular. They were the national heroes against the Nazis. This was a combination, had to be handled somehow. And here's how it was handled. You took Keynesian ideas and you developed, we can do Keynes, but we can do it military. We'll have all the deficit spending we need, but it'll be for the military. We'll do that here in the United States, and we will create an umbrella for the Europeans. And we will say to the Europeans, we've got the nuclear bombs. We are willing to bomb Russia. Look what we did in Japan, blah, 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 all of that. And we'll take care of that. And that will save you all money. You don't have to have a military. You don't really, I mean, a little one, but you don't have to worry about this. And they haven't ever worried about it. That's why they're so impotent now. They can't do anything. Uh, we'll take care of it. And the money you would have had to spend on the military, here's what you do: you give your working classes a standard of social service equal or better than what they get in the Soviet Union to undercut the appeal of the, you don't need socialists and communists, we'll do it. That's why there's free health care. That's why there's free colleges. That's why there's paid vacation for 5 weeks in most Western European countries, something the United States has never enjoyed. They have had now for 50 years. Right? Incredible. But that's how that was done. You could leave their rich people very rich. You wouldn't have to tax them. You use the money you tax from the masses to provide them with social services on a reasonable scale. That will blunt the appeal of socialists and communists. The government of the United States trained and equipped and funded their leaders, all the Christian Democratic. They went to the United States like a rotating seminar. Right? Periodically, it was exposed that the prime minister of Italy or the prime minister of Austria had been funded by something in the United States. Of course, it was a package. And here's the problem: that package is no longer sustainable. It doesn't work. It can't proceed as it has, and no one knew, still doesn't, how exactly to fix all of this. But one idea, here we go now, one idea is to rethink the whole relationship with Russia. I mean, it is relevant, if you think about it, that they got rid of the Soviet Union back in 1989, 1990. Here we are 30 years later, and they're kind of catching up. Gee, if they're not a socialist or communist country, whatever that meant, why are we having any different relationship to them than we have to all the other countries that are governed by pro-capitalist leaderships? And Trump, for God knows what reasons that we will never understand because they're secret and they will be for a long time. Mr. Trump is the one to say, well, the emperor has no clothes. I'm going to try to cut a deal with these people, and I'm not going to be held back by all of you cold warriors, because that's what they were. Just like the leaders of Europe have been living in this world for 50 years, so has Mr. Biden, who was literally a senator of that process for 50 years. So, yeah, of course, he can't make the break. You need a Trump to make the break. But the problems of the United States by this time are far bigger than anything Mr. Trump can do with or without Russia. That's what none of them are able to cognize. That's why Michael and I have an audience, I think, and certainly we have a lot to talk about, because this country faces its decline by denying it's happening. So that creates a window for people like us to simply say, in a way like Trump said about Russia, what are we doing here? We're refusing to face the reality. And here's some of the key things. For the first time in a century, the United States has a real competitor. We're not facing any of that. China is a competitor, way more than Russia ever was. Russia was a poor, backward country from 1917 through the entire Cold War period. They got an impressive military. They devoted an enormous set of resources to doing that, and they did that well. And they did other things well, too. But they were coming from a place that made them no competitor at all. And after World War II, the rest of the capitalist world was no competitor either. Gave the United States an absolutely bizarre independence in which it could indulge whatever the hell it wanted. I mean, exaggerating, but to give you the flavor. That's all over. I mean, today, if I heard correctly, Nima, I believe you mentioned it also. The BYD, you know, which I learned recently stands for Build Your Dream. The BYD Corporation has now come up with a new lithium battery for electric vehicles that blows everybody out of the water. We're going to have those every 3 weeks. I mean, not just from that company and not just in that industry, but that's what it means to have a competitor. And then when you begin to add that in this country, because it is declining, and because the competitor is taking the market, they are they're crunching in, they are shrinking. Look, we are closing universities in this country. The Chinese open a new one every month. I could give you 100, but that's what you get with the decline of one industry versus another, or one region versus another, or now with the United States. And not just China, but look at the alliance, the BRICS that they've built. And the BRICS has already shown itself to be a very powerful geopolitical force because it allowed Russia to find new customers for the oil and gas, thereby nullifying the whole sanctions program, which was dead on arrival because of the new configuration of the world economy. So, what the United States is now trying to do is, in my judgment, an act of total desperation. It is reverting from the neoliberal globalization mantra to the nationalist economic mantra. Privatize what you can at home and then have the government be the protector militarily, with every kind of device to help a corporation not to tax it for anything, have the government keep out the competitor if you can. It's a desperate effort to survive, and it's too little and it's too late. They may have been able to pull it off earlier, but I don't think they can do it anymore. And as that becomes clear, as for example with this lithium battery, another defeat, you're going to see more and more desperate. On a different program, they asked me to come up with a metaphor, and I tried, and the only one I came up with I think is any good is the metaphor from football of the so-called Hail Mary pass. When a team is losing and it's desperate, only got a few seconds or minutes to go, there is a custom in which the quarterback takes the ball and heaves it to a corner of the field and tells all of his teammates who are allowed to catch a ball, be at that corner 26 seconds from now, and I'm going to throw it down there, and it'll bounce around as everybody tries to get their hand on it. And as it bounces around, maybe you will be the one to clutch it to your chest, and we win the game because you caught the pass. But you've given up on strategy. You've given up on. This is luck. You're doing the equivalent of saying a Hail Mary in the Catholic Church, or flipping a coin. You're done. And that's what we are now. We are engaged in the Hail Mary, and that's what Mr. Trump keeps throwing the ball, hoping somehow, because the contradictions are now overwhelming. If you put tariffs, you risk an inflation. If you have an inflation, you nullify your political base. If you have an inflation at the same time that a recession comes in, and then you got stagflation, about which we're hearing again a lot because people are realizing it's coming. How are you gonna manage all of these things? And if you have retaliation, which it looks like you're gonna have, then all bets are off. In the United States, we're going to relearn the lessons after World War I and in the interwar period between one and two. you had this kind of surge of nationalism, and it didn't work. And it was later understood that it contributed to the Great Depression. It was a terrible mistake, but by that, it was too late. And I think you're going down exactly the same path now.
Michael, go ahead.
Well, Richard, when you describe all of the hope and the plans that the United States had when it emerged from World War II, you realize how its operating philosophy and its economy has turned into the diametric opposite. And you've been explaining some of the ways of this. In 1945, the United States promised to support the integration of world trade. And that's because it was going to dominate world trade because it had most of the manufacturing and export capacity. It was going to ensure world peace, as you pointed out, with its military. That's because it had the primary military power and the atom bomb. And that was the basis for the United Nations and its international law. Then the United States had gimmicked and structured the international law of the International Monetary Fund to base the international financial system in a way that favored the United States and dissolved the British Empire, which was its main rival at that time, dissolved any kind of British or French imperial preference for their colonies, and essentially made other countries increasingly dependent on the United States for their agriculture as well as for their industry and for their arms. And that seemed to be the dream. But let's look at today. Everything's the opposite. The United States no longer is based on what it can offer the world. And Trump realizes that it has only one form of persuasion: threats and coercion. This is not a Hail Mary pass. This is a way of somehow threatening the other side of your football game. We're going to injure you and hurt your quarterback and take him out of action. And we're going to win by brutality. And this coercion and policy insists that the Americans must get the better of any trade or international deal. It's going to not be a win-win like what underlies China's trade strategy. It's a loss for other countries. And just yesterday, or maybe it was today's morning, Treasury Secretary Besant said that the Biden sanctions against Russia really are very passive. Trump is preparing new sanctions against Russia to try to hurt it beyond anything that the Biden administration had thought of. That's what the Treasury Secretary said. So in other words, without being able to offer an expansion of world trade, military protection, or even a secure financial dollar, the United States says, what we do have is the ability to threaten and hurt other countries and to organize sanctions and break up the unified world that seemed to be in the process of being created under U.S. leadership back in 1945. It's trying to disrupt trade and financial linkages in order to center them all on the United States or under U.S. ownership. For instance, Trump's recent aim of taking the Panama Canal away from its Chinese owners in Hong Kong. President Xi got quite upset, he said, by the fact that these owners sold out to the U.S. company, BlackRock, I think. But they said, look, if we don't sell out, then Trump's just going to come in with the military and take it away, and we're not going to have anything. He's threatened to invade Panama, and there goes our holding. We don't want to end up with anything. President Xi, do you want to buy? Do you want to top their offer? Do you want to pay $250 million or whatever it is, and then you'll try to fight Trump on on its territory. Well, the Chinese government said, well, we'd hope to trade off this Panama Canal by letting you sell to foreign countries and get some kind of benefit from the United States in return. And now we don't get a benefit. And the Hong Kong company said, well, there never was going to be a real threat of resistance to the United States simply taking over. So the United States has reverted to Britain's old strategy of maintaining dominance by dividing and conquer. China is trying to create a win-win expansion for itself and the rest of Asia by the Belt and Road Initiative. The United States is trying to break up the Belt and Road Initiative, and whereas China is trying to base this initiative, at least for seagoing trade, on port development, the United States is trying to take the ports away from China or foreclosing this. Where China is trying to develop pipelines, oil pipelines to Russia and other places, the United States is trying to say, well, that's going to have to go through countries, and we're going to work with these countries to prevent your pipelines or railroads for going through these countries. We're going to try to prevent the world from being integrated, so it's going to be a wheel and spokes, all focused on the United States, not an overall economic system. Well, what's happened in trade has happened in finance. In 1945, the United States emerged from World War II with 75% of the world's gold supply, and gold continued to flow to the United States until 1950, by which time the United States had 80% of all the world's monetary gold. That is the gold held by central banks as their foreign reserves. What reversed all that was the beginning of the war economy that you pointed out. The Korean War opened in 1950, 1951, and ever since, the United States has run a balance of payments deficit that finally led to force the United States off gold in 1971 and continues to be an enormous cost that, unlike the case in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, cannot be financed by America's trade and financial surplus anymore, because America's deindustrialized by financializing. So the United States is in a position, this is not like a football game anymore. We're talking about two different strategies. The United States has said, well, China and Asia are trying to rise to dominance by being the source of the world's raw materials and industry, working them up, of energy, of technological innovation. What do we have? Finance, and meaning asset price inflation to provide stock market gains and bond market gains, and inflate real estate prices for real estate gains, just like in England, real estate went way up after the Russian economy was destroyed by the kleptocrats buying products there. So the whole strategy of sanctions, again, is to destroy other countries and deny them the ability of trying to develop themselves with a kind of dream that it can somehow reindustrialize and restore the what seems to be a utopia right now of what it had in 1945. But that's what's so crazy. It doesn't have the industrial power to do that. And Trump has an industrial strategy of whether it's a devaluation of the dollar or support of the dollar that he thinks somehow is going to lead to new factories being created here. Germany and France and other countries will relocate their production in the United States, but it takes many years to build a factory and to put in place a supply line for the factory and a marketing distribution plan. There's no way that in the immediate future during Trump's administration, the United States can even begin to reindustrialize in practice, so that the United States essentially doesn't have any plan at all. There's not even a Hail Mary pass. There are some bizarre suggestions that I can get over, I guess, in the next part of the discussion. But for Trump's team, a multipolar world that now you have the Foreign Secretary acknowledging that we're in that means one that's divided and conquered. Not an integrated system, a multipolar. It means just divided and conquered when there's really still only one pole, and that's the United States. And the result of that is chaos, not consolidation. So the question is, why don't other countries withdraw from its orbit? Well, what makes things so bizarre is that they're not doing that. They're going along with letting Trump take the initiative without having any guiding philosophy. So there's no way that other countries can even anticipate what the United States foreign policy can be. And I don't think either of us can even guess what it would be. On the one hand, Trump wants a strong dollar to prevent other currencies or gold from becoming vehicles. On the other hand, he thinks that a weak dollar is going to help exports and make our exports of industrial products cheaper. But if the United States is not producing industrial goods to export, how does currency depreciation help when there's nothing to lower the exchange rate for? Trump says that tariff protection, in other words, another barrier to international trade, reversing the whole free trade movement of 1945. He says tariff protection is going to promote new industrial investment and employment. But again, it takes so many years to do that the world is changing so rapidly that the United States mode of industrial investment is mainly to make money financially, not industrially. It's like the military making the airplanes and the weapons, not really to be able to fight against Russia. And you had the F-14, I think, shot down a day or two ago over Ukraine by the Russian planes that were militarily superior, while costing maybe 10% to do. Trump says he wants perpetual bonds to other countries. If they buy U.S. securities, they're not. These securities can't be redeemed for a century. In other words, you're going to lock in. You're going to just stop the world from being able to de-dollarize, to move away from the dollar, to become independent of the dollar. He's trying to do everything he can to stop the independence. And as we've seen militarily, we're seeing the whole fight in the Near East now, saying, well, at least we can control the world's oil and it's international trade. So I think when you juxtapose what the strategy is today and the policy and how it is reversed, everything in 1945, why is Europe gone along with? What does the United States have to offer the world anymore? I can't figure it out. And all that the United States and NATO have is a narrative that, well, we're protecting against Russia, sending 10 million troops to occupy Europe again, as if Russia really wants Europe, and the whole fantasy of Russia as a threat. So we're back to what you described in 1945, the Russian threat. But it's a fiction now. The world of 1945 no longer exists, and the United States is living in it. And the question is, how long can it try to convince the rest of the world to remember the myth and the hopes back then, not look at the present?
By the way, the fighter jet that was shot down was a F-16, Michael.
16, yes.
Yeah.
Who's keeping track? You're right.
No,
Richard, go ahead.
I think, again, as I've said, I agree with what Michael is saying, and I'll rethink my Hail Mary and see if I can come up with a with a better metaphor. I think where we agree crucially, with or without Hail Mary, is that it's very hard to discern from the chaotic behavior of Mr. Trump what in the world the plan, quote unquote, is. What are you getting? Let me give you two or three examples. If you are going to throw tariffs around as a major tool of policy, then you are inviting other countries to do two things: retaliate with tariffs of their own, but start seriously to look for ways to insulate themselves from the obvious vulnerability that you have exposed by hitting them with a tariff. If Canada sends electricity to the United States in large quantities and lives off of it, and the United States is in a position which they have known, I mean, it doesn't take advanced degrees in economics to know that if you're selling a large portion of whatever it is you produce to one buyer, and that one buyer chooses not to play the game, you're going to be in trouble. That's not all that complex. What are they going to do now? And here's the answer. They're going to go to the next best likely buyer in the hopes that they can get a better deal. And that next likely buyer, for example, electricity from Canada, is China. And what does that mean? And whatever the Canadians say or don't say, that's the reality that they face. Would make no sense to go to Europe given the conditions there. The United States has told them, we're going to abuse you. So what's left is China and the BRICS in some way or other. That's a part of the world that needs energy. Canada is part of the world that produces energy. Okay, we can see where it is going. And that's a more dominant storyline than what Mr. Trump can do. And then there's what Mr. Trump is actually doing. If you are a capitalist and you have a factory, this is sort of spelling out what Michael said, and you have a factory in Mexico, and you spent 5 years and $10 billion developing the infrastructure and the factory and the labor force and all of the things. And why did you do it? Because of NAFTA. You did it because you can produce low-wage workers in Mexico and then ship it 200 miles into Texas, and there's no tariff, no duty. Okay. Now Mr. Tariff says we're changing, and Mr. Trump says we're changing everything in order to get that factory to move to Texas. That's not going to happen. And I'll tell you why. The vice president in charge of plant location wouldn't dare move the factory to Texas to spend another $1 billion, because it's very expensive to do. Take another year or 2 or 3 when you're not in the business because you're building a factory. You can't deliver your orders because of that. And then the risk that this bizarre president, whose opposition seems to be getting stronger almost every day, he may reverse himself. He already has reversed himself more than once on these tariffs. I'm going to initiate an expensive move that could be rendered absurd next week or next month or next year. I'm not going to do that. Part of the talk of a recession coming now is corporations are suspending investment projects because they can't see what to do. They can't make a decision, build it in Mexico or build it in New York or build it in Nigeria or wherever their options are. That decision is now impossible to make. And they don't have any courage. They know that if they make an investment and it turns out to be the wrong one, and their competitor chose the different option, and that turned out to be the right one, their career is done. They're not going to do that. They're going to wait. That's more safe playing within the corporate universe. This is a concrete way of showing what Michael meant when he said, you can't overnight. Mr. Trump, who's only going to be president for another 3.5 years, he's going to be a lame duck the second half of that period anyway. And if he loses a significant number of the supporters, because his margin in the House of Representatives is very small, he lose half a dozen seats in the House of Representatives, becomes a Democratic place. They'll stall everything he tries to do, and then every decision made by a corporate executive now looks ridiculous 18 months from now. You can't function. You can't do this. Now, people have asked me, well, is it impossible? Well, then I come back to my Hail Mary. No. I mean, if the tariffs don't get retaliated, if something independent happens in Europe or Asia that I didn't foresee, could all of this in some magical way, yeah, like a Hail Mary pass, the ball could come down just in the person you hoped it would. Is that 100% impossible? No, not very likely. Not something you'd want to bet on, but not impossible either. And that's what an awful lot of these presidents hope for. And I think when you have an empire going down, that's what the people who are in charge of those empires as they go down, that's what they're reduced to. They can't control it. In this country, they can't control it because they don't even admit it. But there is a chance, and that's what they hope for. They hope that there's a chance. But that's what we're living with. And the sense that Americans have, and the sense I'm sure is in the minds of many of the people watching this program, that things are very chaotic, that things are very loose, that we don't know from one day, and that the leaders don't seem to, that's a correct perception. That's a very good understanding, even if it isn't tutored and doesn't have the statistics to back it up. The instinct there is an accurate one.
Well, Michael, the magic word you used was bizarre when it comes to Trump. And there is something approximating your Hail Mary pass. Yesterday, Vice President Vance put a video up on X Post, and he, I think, states the U.S. strategy back in 1945 in more naked terms than you or I have done. What he said, quote, "The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while the poorer countries made the simpler things." But then he added, it didn't work out that way. And he said, that's a tragedy that it didn't work out that way. It meant globalization was a failure because the whole form of globalization that was planned in 1945 was to polarize the economy, not to make countries economically equal, as academic free trade theory pretends with its unrealistic assumptions, but to essentially replace colonialism and military force with economic pressures, sanctions, and a biased structuring of the laws of international trade and payments and finance in a way that maintains the inequality. Well, what happened with first NAFTA and then later in the Clinton administration, the admission of China into the WTO, was that China succeeded much better than expected. It didn't simply produce low labor products. It moved up the value chain, exactly what Vance said was the aim of U.S. to oppose. It was moving up, and instead of maintaining global inequality, China moved along with the rest of Asia and said, look, we have a plan of development that incidentally is the exact same plan of development that made the United States rich in the 19th century. Protective tariffs, government subsidy, government infrastructure spending, and above all, keeping finance as a public utility, not letting it become a separate sector at war with industrialization. So you have this, again, this strategy of being able to hurt other countries to maintain the system of trade and development that benefits the United States. That's what's so bizarre about it. And it's bizarre to think that somehow the United States can go back to following the Chinese model, which means its own 19th century model that Trump says that he loves, McKinley and the whole flowering of U.S. industrialization that was very largely based on government infrastructure investment for transportation, communications, schooling, all of the things that we consider to be basic human needs and basic human rights, so that they would not be monopolized by rent seekers backed by Wall Street and the financial sector. But for Trump, all of a sudden, this whole system of development that China's doing and that America initially did and that Germany did in the 19th century, France followed to some extent, and that England had done earlier, all of that is somehow reduced to a one-dimensional slogan, tariffs. And Trump says, if we can finance the United States budget deficit by tariffs, then we won't have to tax the rich. We won't have to tax my supporters, the donor class, the financial class, the finance, insurance, and real estate, fire sector. Who will bear the cost? He thought that other countries would have to bear the cost of tariffs to finance the U.S. budget, but in practice, it'll be the American consumers. Well, Nima's question was, what's the effect on the economy? Following this idea of making foreign countries pay to support an American empire and the economic strategy of American empire by means of imposing barriers, tariff barriers, sanctions, financial barriers, financial tariffs on foreign investment in the United States is one of the things that Trump has said. Why only put tariffs on goods? Why not stop other countries from trying to invest in stocks and bonds? Why do we want to give them a chance to make money on American finance? Let's make them pay a tariff, a charge, a super rent charge on this. All of this is exactly the reverse of what really happened in the McKinley era, what really happened in American industrialization, and what China has showed work today. The one thing that the Americans are not going to do is succeed in the way that China and Asia and even Russia in its economic reorganization are succeeding, by a mixed public-private economy aimed at raising living standards, educational levels, productivity, self-sufficiency. This is the essence of how a logical development plan would be. That is exactly what the United States has ruled out. So one wonders why yesterday and today the stock market's going up, as we're seeing the threat of trying to enforce all of this bizarre policy by military means in the Middle East, for instance.
I also, let me add, there's a kind of lesson here in Marx's old idea about uneven development. The ideological framework here, because they can't face the realities that we're trying to get at in our conversation. They have to deny all of that. Instead of understanding what Chinese competition means, they are presented as a cheater and an aggressor, and all of this BS that wastes everybody's time. I mean, I understand its ideological function, but it seems to me they don't really understand what they're doing. So listening to Michael, you use tariffs, you use sanctions, you are a bully, you are trying to control. It's the opposite of the neoclassical economics dream of an automatic mechanism in which everybody looking out for their own self-interest will end up producing the optimum for the society as a whole, which is what the economics profession teaches, mostly to itself. Here's the irony. It leads you to make one blunder after another. Yesterday, Elon Musk made a statement about how enthusiastic he is for the privatization of Amtrak and the post office. And in his discussion, apparently cited the fact, I mean, it's almost embarrassing to say this, but that they aren't profitable. And if only they were privatized, you see, then they would be driven by a profit maximizing capitalist. So I find, I'm being asked about this on television. I find myself having to explain to the television host, a person less scholarly than you are, Nima, by a lot, and explain to him, no, you moron, they make no profit because they have low prices. And the low prices charged by the post office and Amtrak are a subsidy to every private capitalist who uses the railroad and the post office, which is everyone. This is a government subsidy program to private enterprise. And if you privatized it, you would remove the subsidy. And unless you can show me that the profits that would be earned by the railroads and the post office in their enormity and in their social consequences are greater than all the losses that businesses would suffer, who would suddenly have to pay more for the railroad and the post office. And the point is, he's so ignorant, Mr. Musk, that there is a culture that he's part of. I don't think it's unique to him, in which you babble the old mantra, private is better than public, even in the middle of a program which, as Michael has pointed out, raises the public. Sanctions, tariffs, public intervention is the name of the game of Trump. Look what he's doing to the federal employees. He's just firing them. That's a governmental intrusion. Everything they do is nationalist, management, sanctioned, bullying. Meanwhile, they intone the mantra of privatization. It is extraordinary. And you don't see in their faces or in their articulations any awareness of the absurdity of what is being said here. China is our enemy because of the enormous power of the government, the state, the Communist Party. And what is it they're doing? They are giving enormous extra power to the state, to the government, and to the Trump party, which is, it is a joke. It is a joke. How do you manage, maybe this is my question to the two of you, how do you manage to understand that among the bizarre things we are living through is a bizarre disconnect between the articulated philosophy we are part of and what these people are actually doing every day.
Well, here's the missing word from what you've been describing, Richard: economic rent. If you privatize Amtrak and Post Office, they're not going to be making more profits. They're making monopoly rent, defined as the excess of market price that they charge over and above the cost of production. Now, right now, the United States has been subsidizing these basic public utilities in order to sell them even below the cost of production. So, as you said, this makes the private sector operate on a lower cost basis. So, the effect of creating monopoly rents is going to turn the United States into an economy where it's very much like Britain's fight against the landlords that led Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and all of the classical economists to say the objective of industrial capitalism is to get rid of economic rents. What the Trump administration and Vance are for is saying this is the end of industrial capitalism. We have now gone beyond it by going backwards. We are going back to pre-capitalist economic formations. We're going back to the monopoly rents under feudalism. We're going back to predatory finance that industrial capitalism was supposed to go beyond by essentially industrializing the financial system, instead finance what has happened is that industry's been financialized, just the reverse. So we're reversing the entire strategy by which industrial capitalism took off in the 19th century. And that's why the one word that cannot be said is economic rent, as distinct from profit. That is what explains what is after, because the Wall Street and the financial investors are looking for opportunities to create economic rent by privatization. Companies will borrow money from the financial sector to buy Amtrak and the post office. That will add debt service to the cost of Amtrak and post office. They will already have to pay the existing cost of production, the full cost without any subsidy or loss. And because they're monopolies, they can charge whatever they want. And essentially, Amtrak and the post office in America will be America's version of Thames Water in England, that has vastly increased water costs to England, all by and Thames Water has taken a company that had zero debt when it began, and it's now has so much debt it's in bankruptcy proceedings with the government and asking for another bailout, saying if you don't, because we've spent all the money on debt on paying the financial backers instead of cleaning up the water supply, you've got to give us more money so finally we can begin to do what we promised to do in the first place. So I think you can think of Donald Trump and Vance as America's versions of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Do we really want to go back to that? Well, yes, we do, says the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the mainstream media. So I think what we've been doing on this show with Nima is presenting a different narrative, an alternative narrative to the self-destructive narrative that we're getting from the Trump administration, the Biden administration, the Obama administration before that, the whole narrative that has essentially destroyed America's industrial capitalism. It's not socialism.
Yeah, the irony, in not to be professorial here, but then again, Michael and I are what we are. good old Karl Marx distinguished between money lending capitalist, merchant capitalist, and industrial capitalist. And the whole point, and all through his 3 volumes of Capital, that's crucial. Volume 1 is about the industrial capitalist, and then volumes 2 and 3 take us how they connect to the other. But there's a crucial difference that he makes crystal clear. When you lend money as a capitalist, you lend 100, you get back 105. The extra 5 you got is not an extra output that the society produced. It's just that the deal is, I give you X, you got to give me more than X back. It's a redistribution of what already exists. The same thing with merchant. I buy something, I then resell it at a higher price. I haven't done anything. I've just bought and sold the same thing. But the whole difference of industrial is when you use your money not to lend it, not to buy and resell something, but instead to buy a worker, to buy a machine, to buy raw materials, and actually produce. And then Marx shows us more value than you started with. So if you want to understand economic growth, and you want to understand provisioning of a growing population, you've got to, if we understood that, then we would not be able to say, well, let the market go the way it wants. Because if you do, you get a system like ours in which we see lots of merchant capital and lots of money lending capital, but a shrinking share of the industrial. And it would have worried us more. What is this imbalance happening? Is this a problem? We've been better Marxists than decades ago. That would have become a conversation in the United States rather than being handled as a misunderstanding, which is how the neoclassical establishment handled this, that this was in the nature of efficiency to have things go like this and not understanding. It's a lesson in how what theory of economics you use will have an enormous impact on whether and how you understand your situation and what kind of policies you do or do not pursue. We are living the fruits of a very and an anti-Marxist approach, because that could never be part of the national conversation, as a feature of the Cold War.
Well, understanding the situation means how to conceptualize it. And Trump's team has said, well, we're going to redefine gross national product and what the economy is doing. We're going to exclude government. Why? Well, if we sell off Amtrak and the post office, the government's going to shrink. And if what Musk is doing is cutting up government, slashing and burning, shrinking, and that would mean GDP is going down. And he said, so we're going to show that, yes, government's going down, but the non-government private sector of GDP is going up. But how is it going up with Amtrak and the post office? It's not going up by actually producing more Amtrak services or more post office services. Is going up by economic rent. And economic rent and interest charges are not a product. They're a transfer payment. And so if we could somehow get a group that was willing to go through the accounting practice of saying, okay, how much of our GDP is actually a product and how much is not a product at all, but just economic rent, price without value. Product is supposed to be the value of the economy, but instead it's just the price of the economy with economic rent. This is the opposite of everything the classical economics, Adam Smith, etc., were really all about. So I think when we talk about Marx, we're talking about the Marx who came at the culmination, the peak of classical economics, taking these concepts of economics, by which industrial capitalism took off, and saying this is the logic of industrial capitalism. This is the logic that is going to enable it to grow more and more, and that means it's going to grow by public sector investment, and that's socialism. It's going to grow by supporting labor and living standards, providing housing, healthcare, education. That's socialism. And that's what the word people were using in the 19th century. So what we're trying to do in all of the shows that we're doing is not only describing what used to be the vocabulary to discuss this, but the whole concept of what used to be socialism, which was capitalism, the logic of capitalism evolving. And by doing that, we can show how what we're doing is rolling back time, way before 1945 that we begin by talking about, way back before 1776. That's what we're talking about. And a historical perspective and a vocabulary perspective makes all of this clear.
Yeah, it reminds me of what I love to teach when I teach these kinds of courses, that the labor theory of value, which people attribute to Marx got that from Smith and Ricardo. It was part of the classical school because they wanted to show everybody that in the end, what limits what a society can produce for itself is the capacity to do work. How many able-bodied adults do you have? That's the limit of what you can do. Now you have to allocate them to the different things you want, but you want a limit, there's your limit. You can't do more than you have the brains and muscles aggregated to do. And so the value, if that's what we're trying to understand in an economy, is this core of labor capacity. And every object is the embodiment of a share of what you got to work with. How much of that labor, abstract labor, Marx called it, that you can get. The irony was what Marx took their understanding of the labor foundation for work and an economy and showed that it involved stealing, taking from the worker a portion of the value that the worker added when he or she worked, paying him a wage that had less value in it than the value added by the worker when the worker worked. And that surplus, that's this thing that the capitalist takes and then has the arrogance of suggesting that it isn't the worker from whom he's taken it, it's something intrinsic he contributes. That's how you got the crazy ideas of risk. Oh, the entrepreneur takes risk, as if the worker who comes to work for that entrepreneur isn't taking a risk by doing so. I mean, the absurd effort. And what Michael is showing us is here's a double historical irony. Capitalism, terrified by what Marx taught, teaching the workers, you are the source of that which oppresses you. That capitalist, what he has, you made. People just like you. And they didn't keep it, just like you're not keeping it. And that's how he gets it. This was so terrifying that they had to get rid of the whole thing. They got rid of the baby with the bathwater. They had to find another way to explain why things worked the way they were. And they came up with a theory that what makes something valuable is not the labor that's in it, but the utility. There's a good one, you derive from it. And that means that what we get in the market, the price, is the value because it shows how much people want it. Therefore, value versus price, a distinction crucial for Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, disappears in the neoclassical world. The theory which looks abstract and isn't, in theory, you fight out the very same struggle that's going on in the street outside where the theorists are having their confab.
I agree.
Thank you so much. Michael, do you want to add something?
No, I agree. This is what we've been saying. It's not the most topical discussion to put it in the long historical setting, but this is what you need in order to understand what's
Understand.
happening today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In
Thank you.
in case people are wondering, just speaking for myself, in case people are wondering, it was for me, learning what Marx had to teach changed everything. If whatever I say makes sense, then please understand you're talking to Marx. I'm just an intermediary applying, using, but the apparatus is buried in the work of that extraordinary fellow. And if you haven't spent some time learning it, do yourself and all of us a favor and go do it.
Thank you so much, Richard and Michael, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Same here.